Yeah, if you could just provide a brief intro about any new projects or works that you're performing, that would be great while we wait for the questions to come in.
Okay, sure. Well, uh, during this time, seeing that there haven't been performances right now this year. I mean, I've had a few, but mostly things that were scheduled got canceled or postponed till later. So this was kind of a unique opportunity. I'm usually preparing repertoire all the time, and getting ready for performances, as well as obviously teaching and my sort of daily, weekly work here at the university, at Indiana University. But during this time, since that wasn't the case, and it's maybe the first time in many years, maybe 35 years, that I haven't had to be preparing repertoire all the time. And so I sort of took that opportunity to just look more deeply into what and exploring my playing, and in particular experimenting with different things in technique and sound, and getting in particular, I kind of spent a lot of time working in thumb position and exploring that more deeply. So I did a lot of scales and things like that, just very basic things, which I normally, would do, but not in the kind of depth and detail that I did during this time. And so it's been very interesting. I've learned so much, and I'm really it's been fantastic, actually, to be able to do that. So I see that there's a question now. So the question says, in your career as an orchestral musician, both as principal cellist of Los Angeles Philharmonic and associate principal of Philadelphia and Hartford, how did you adjust your playing to various conductors? And could you detail your experience in each orchestra? Okay, well, I actually, when I was in high school, I auditioned for the Hartford Symphony. I was going to a small private high school in West Hartford, Connecticut, and they had an arts program at this high school, and that's why I went there. And it was called the Watkinson School. And there was an audition for the Hartford Symphony, and I don't know what possessed me to do that, but for some reason, I went and I auditioned, and was shocked to get in. So I started playing in the Hartford Symphony, when I was in high school, and it was, a real professional orchestra with several concerts a month, and it was all, it was this all kinds of repertoire. And the music director was Arthur Winograd, who had been the founding cellist of the Juilliard String Quartet. And he had a very, very good ear, and he could hear if there was a wrong note somewhere, even in a really complicated contemporary piece. He would know it, like exactly what if what he saw in the score wasn't actually happening. and consequently, his conducting style as well was very exacting. I mean, he was sort of, just very, very precise and clear. And so it was actually a really good experience to start because, I could, I really could to learn how to sort of to be with the conductor pretty easily because he was very clear, so it was easy to play with him. And then I ended up going on to school, and so I left. I went to the Curtis Institute, so I left the Hartford Symphony. And then did other things along the way, but eventually when I wound up in Philadelphia, that was when I joined. It was with Riccardo Muti, and he is he's one of the great conductors of our time. One of the greatest conductors of our time. And I think, the really incredible thing about being exposed to that, to working with a conductor like that is, there's so much you can learn, and I think it had a tremendous influence for me. Sort of being in rehearsal with him and hearing what he had to say and how he approached different repertoire and certainly it was fascinating and interesting and inspiring, and so as a result, I think it had an effect. I started to find myself very influenced by that when I was working on repertoire, my own solo repertoire or chamber music or anything else, because there was so much to be gained. And so I think with him, now to say specifically what that would be very hard to quantify, because it's kind of a global thing. I mean, it's working, it's kind of getting acquainted with somebody's view of this repertoire. And then when he left, Wolfgang Sawallisch came, and that was just an equally wonderful, but in a very different way. And so, I think that just, there was just always something to be learned. To say exactly what those things were, very hard to quantify. I wish I could, but I don't know if I really can. But then, ultimately, you sort of take these things in, and the more you do, the more you develop, I think, in general. And then in Los Angeles, it was first S.F.Pekka Salonen, and there, the repertoire was very different, and the whole experience is each orchestra has a very different kind of set of priorities, I would say, like in terms of, what's important to sort of overall, to sort of the consensus, the general consensus of the group, what's important to them varies. And, and so, going from Philadelphia to Los Angeles is just completely different in that way. And again, it's like, it's great to have different experiences if you can, because, then it's, it just adds more dimension, overall as a performer to have that. And, finally, Gustavo Dudamel came to Los Angeles, and he again was marvelous to work with, and a completely another very different angle. And I mean, if you're familiar with these conductors, you would know, you would know what I mean anyway, probably, like if you heard performances of them. I mean, it's quite clear what their different styles are. And I suppose I'm as a result, because I think I was open to it, I think probably my playing did change, in certain ways, interacting with them. So that's a really, it's a hopefully I'm answering your question. I hope so. It's a good question. Okay, so next one here I have is, okay, so what are some things you teach your students that helped you in your own personal studies, that helped you work on intonation and relaxed shifting? Okay. Okay, I understand. So, in other words, I think, just to rephrase that to see if I have this right, what are things that I worked on that I suggest that my students work on for intonation and relaxed shifting? Okay. So I think the intonation is a big subject. So, but I think I'd like to go into that and talk about it. And I think I can correlate those two things in a way that hopefully will be helpful and answer your question. First and foremost, I think that with intonation, knowing what you want the pitch to sound like is the first step. I mean, you have to be very, very, very clear about what you think the pitch is. That's the first step. And that means, by whatever means, if need be, if you can use a tuner, some kind of meter that measures your pitch. And there's a lot of different discussions about this. Should it be sort of fixed and tempered, and or should it move, and that kind of thing. I think a good place to start, for sure, is just to be tempered, to be able to be tempered, especially as a cellist, because we're very rarely the top voice. And so often we're either mixed in with other voices or we're at the bass. And so as a result, if there's a lot of fluctuation and you're in either the middle or lower range in the voicing of a piece, then that's going to have a direct effect on everything that's above it or around it. If you're above everything else, certain notes sometimes can have a little bit of, sort of maybe flexibility, because it doesn't have as direct an effect on the intonation of the what's around you. But as a cellist, I mean, unless you're playing by yourself, if you're playing Bach, I mean, that gives you a little, perhaps some flexibility. But if you're playing with piano, if you're playing in a string quartet, if you're playing in an orchestra, you're usually having to adjust your intonation to another instrument. And your voicing is usually somehow within the texture, even if it's the lead voice. So often you have to, the tempered intonation, if you're capable of doing that, then that means, if you need to play with piano, you can be relatively comfortable with that. And also just having that sort of clarity and assuredness of what the pitch is, I think, the simplicity of that, I think is helpful. And then, so the shifting, and so to continue with that idea, I mean, I think that there are different approaches there are different ways that work for different people for how to achieve that consistency. There's one approach is to to do scales, arpeggios, and intervals, and using a meter, and tuning every note and really getting, very solidly clear about it in the context of a scale or an arpeggio, and also the intervals. And then that, carries over into the repertoire. And, or you could also do that and as well tune every note in a piece of music that you're working on, and take all the time that you need to do that. And so I have a system for that, which I think can be effective for this. And that is that you basically start by just tuning one note at a time in the piece, which means basically like going one bow per note. So it takes time. You have to be patient with it. And then connecting the notes. So it would be like, you would start with just maybe tuning each note individually. Let me see if I can think of something to demonstrate it on, but it could be anything really, but like, kind of just doing one note at a time like that, and using the meter to tune each one, and then connecting the notes. So the first one is tuning the notes individually. The second one is listening to them, connecting them, listening to the connections, and making sure that they're smooth. And the reason that I'm going so slow is to stay very relaxed and to keep the integrity of your posture in line, and everything really very relaxed and in good form. Because that way you can sort of build that into it. So you're not developing tensions or or anything as you're working on it. And then kind of 1, 2, like, so connecting the notes. Like that. And then 2 notes to a bow with no rhythm. So just, this is always all with no rhythm. It's just even. So. So you're very gradually picking up the pace so you can maintain the integrity of the intonation. You don't lose it as you go faster. And then you can start to do more in rhythm. Like that. And then you see what I mean? So very gradually increasing it. And that, I think, sort of helps to sort of solidify the consistency of the intonation. As far as the shifting, again, a lot of it has to do with being very clear about what the pitch is that you're shifting to. So if you're precise about that, then it's a matter of maybe, going very slowly at first as well. So let's say, so if I'm going to this note, let's say, then part of it has to do with, let's say this is where I want to end, and this is the position I want my hand to be in. Then I want to sort of have that already there before I get there. So that I'm not adjusting anything when I get there, okay? And so I'm just being consistent physically, and then just moving the hand into position. The other thing is to avoid any, too many variables, so that the 2 simplest things are just not to do anything with the wrist like this, and not to twist the hand. So if you move, then in other words, if you can see this relationship here, I try to keep consistent. So this is basically the same that it is here. So I don't change, I don't, that kind of thing, or any kind of other thing like that. And I don't turn my hand or, anything like that, so and that way, the less moving parts there are, the less complicated the shift is, and the more likely it is to be accurate. And then the last thing is kind of the hidden part of it, is the speed of the shift. And that is the consistency of the movement. In other words, so if I'm kind of moving at an even rate of speed, then it's easier to sort of, control where I'm going and when I'm stopping. If there's inconsistency in the speed, or it's sudden and kind of fast, sometimes it has to be, but if you can practice doing it this way, then even if you have to go fast, it doesn't feel fast actually, because you're spreading out the amount of time very evenly, even if it's very quick. And so you kind of have control, more control over when you arrive. But if you're not clear about what that pitch is, then it won't matter, all those other things. So it's really starts with that, being sure about the pitch, and then how you move to it, can certainly make a difference. And certainly what I was saying before, about, when I was demonstrating a little bit of the Casals, that sort of process of going really slowly. It is time consuming, and it is sort of, but all I can say is, I've done it that way, and it seems to work. If you'd have to try it and see if that works for you. But I think also, sort of practicing, certainly practicing the scales, just being really clear about your tonality and different keys and things, certainly would add to that, and in some cases might even be enough to make it work when you're playing a repertoire. Okay, so let's see. What are your thoughts on Bach suite marathons, 6 suites in 1 or 2 programs? How was your process of preparation for your Bach marathon in the Philadelphia Chamber Society? Okay, Bach marathon. Well, actually, the actual length of the program it's big, certainly, but it's not. It ends up being about it. Let's say, I don't even know if it's 120 minutes of music. I think it's probably around 100 minutes, maybe, or something like that. It's just that it's nonstop playing. You're playing every minute of that. So it's that's the kind of the challenge with that. And the first time I did all of the suites in a concert, I didn't actually do that until the first time I did it, I was, I think, about 40 years, a little bit over 40, maybe 42. That was the first time that I did that. And, by then I had performed all of the suites and concerts, not together, but in each suite I had performed multiple times. And so, it was, I already had a lot of experience with them. That said, I think a lot of it, even if that is the case, doesn't mean you would necessarily feel okay doing something like that physically, because it is, but I think what it requires, just from a physical standpoint, you really have to have your sort of things worked out in your technique to the extent that you're not overexerting yourself in any kind of way. Kind of how to I think I can take this back to maybe the earlier, when I was younger and I played Bach suites. I think the first time that I played the C minor suite, the fugue, I played the prelude and the fugue. I didn't even play the whole thing. And this is when I was probably 17 or something like that. And I played a fugue and my arm felt like it hurt, at the end of it. It was just, I couldn't imagine playing more than that, and I think over time, I just, it was a priority for me to sort of figure out how to be able to play and not feel tired or fatigued, which meant I think ultimately what it is if the right muscles are doing the right things, the body can work very efficiently at playing the cello, basically. I mean, you know, you need to just make sure that the things are balanced the way they need to be in terms of your effort. And that, you know, goes from, you know, even basic things like how you raise your arms, you know, so that when you raise your arms, you're using your lat muscles, you know, the muscles back here to support, you know, for example, as opposed to pulling up from your deltoids or trapezius muscle here, so that you're kind of supporting from below and also your core, you know, so that then you can move freely. And then the other thing is that there's that generally what makes muscles get tired is if you make them hold positions for a long period of time. So a lot of it has to do with, you know, for instance, even just like a down bow and an up bow, like there are different muscles moving, you know, the down bow from the up bow. So, but that if you understand that, for example, like I'm just doing, I can see one group of muscles does the first part, and then it releases when the other group of muscles comes in. You know, in the left hand, when, you know, a finger goes down, then if the other ones let go when they're not working, then they rest, you know, more or less. So I think working on that, you know, real kind of minutia in terms of, you know, learning how to release things when you're not using them, you know, was something that I spent an enormous amount of time on, you know, to acquire that. And I ultimately found that I could play a Bach suite and I didn't feel tired at all, you know, when it was finished. And you know, in fact, I could play another one, you know, if I, you know, and so I sort of discovered over time, having done this work to, you know, kind of learn how to release muscles when you're not using them, and get the support from the right places. I just found that I could actually, you know, play them all, you know, if I need, and when it was over, you know, I really felt like, I honestly felt like if I had to, I could have done it again, you know, because it just, I didn't feel, you know, I felt like I sort of, you know, exercised, but not overwhelmed, you know, so in terms of the preparation, I think it was a long time in the coming, I think is what I'm getting at here. It's sort of like, by the time I actually ended up doing that, I'd already worked out a lot of things that made that possible. And so I kind of found that I could do it. And the opportunity was presented to me, and I did it. And I've done it since then a number of times. It's the interesting thing is, I find sometimes the next day, you know, when if I have to play something else, or I go to rehearsal, and I'm practicing a little bit, I feel like I can play anything. You know, it's just, and it sort of caught me by surprise, you know, like it just has this kind of effect on it makes everything easier. somehow. It seemed like after doing it, and I didn't feel tired. I felt like kind of empowered by that experience. Okay, let's see. How do you train students' ears to listen deeply, especially when they practice? Good question. Yeah. Well, everyone has different levels of, kind of ability to concentrate, or or even just an attention span, and so it depends so much on each individual person. What are the things that they need to focus on in terms of paying attention when they're practicing and really listening and being very aware. And I think certainly I suppose that probably the thing that has the best effect in that way is to draw people's attention to all of the detail that is perhaps missing in what they're doing, in some cases, and the easiest thing to say is, of course, intonation. It doesn't sound in tune. You need to focus on that. But even things like, well, to listen to how you're beginning a note. How are you articulating notes? How do they start? How do they? Things like that. That just kind of, or in some cases, pointing out that the A string is sticking out, or that their bow speed is changing quite drastically when they move from one note to the next, when they change their bow. And do they want that? Is that on purpose? Are you intending for that note to have a different kind of intensity, right? So I think probably it's kind of an organic process in that sense. The more I draw attention to the detail, then the more likely people are to start to become aware of it. And then once you're aware of something like that, it's hard to turn it off again. It's like once you draw, because it's also interesting, it becomes more interesting. Like if you start to listen, like, well, how am I starting this note? Like, how does the sound start? What kind of beginning do I want it to have? And certainly, then, go away, they come back. And then, if they really take that on and they take it in, then, there's a difference, and they start to pay attention, and then they might start to notice some other things. And a lot of times it's just very subtle. Like I might just start to kind of feel like, wow, it's starting to sound really different, and it's just sort of happening in that particular way. However, if it doesn't change, then there's kind of a broken record approach to it. At that point, you just kind of say the same thing again. It's like, how many times does this person want to hear this? Before they finally are like, I kind of had that experience with one of my teachers when I was really young, and he kind of, I played something and we was talking about phrasing, and he said, can you phrase it this way? And I thought I was phrasing it the way that he was saying, but he asked me to do it, so he I guess it didn't sound like I was doing that, right? You know, so I played it again, and then he just said it again. Oh, well, you know, okay, but can you try to phrase it to this way? You know, sort of like, okay, at that time I thought I really did that, you know, and I finally did what I just thought was ridiculous, you know, totally extreme, you know, and then he was like, oh, okay, that's right. And that's a slightly different thing, you know, because that's sort of about learning how to project what you're hearing and being aware of it from that side of it. But it's a similar idea. I mean, that could have that same effect if you were to kind of, he just said it again. He didn't get upset. He didn't, you know, he just kept saying it until I really changed it, you know. And so sometimes that you know, that approach works, you know. If that doesn't, then, you know, then it becomes, you know, more of a look into, well, what are you actually doing when you're practicing? You know, what's really going on there, you know, and really discussing it and trying to kind of externalize what's happening to draw somebody's attention to it and say, you know, you're not achieving what I think you could be, because, you know, you may not be paying attention enough, or kind of focusing your concentration on what you're doing enough in your practice for it to be effective. And, you know, and just by addressing that, I think ultimately, you know, if one can't get to that on their own, bringing it up and kind of addressing it, I think ultimately is certainly, when they go back to practice, they're not going to forget that you had that conversation, you know, so hopefully that's effective. Okay, so there's you mentioned that you have worked on basics in great detail during the pandemic. Would you tell us more about exactly how you approach this detailed work? Okay. Well, you know, I had more free time than, you know, that I've had since I was 4 years old, I think, you know, because, you know, we had, you know, winter break, for instance, and so there was all this free time, and also the summer, because all the summer festival concerts had been canceled, and so I was at home all that time, and I did a lot of practicing then. But, you know, it sort of hit a certain point in January. It was like, well, you know, I started feeling like, you know, here I have all this time, and I really want to, you know, I feel like I want to make the best use of it, you know, and you know, people are doing all these things. They're, you know, reading these novels they haven't read and all this stuff, you know, and I kind of was kind of at a loss and really feeling like, how can I really make use of this? And then it occurred to me that since I don't have to prepare for a concert, it's an opportunity for me to look into things that I feel like I need to change in my technique or in the way that I play, you know, basically. And, you know, this is, and so the modality that I chose to do that was just to do scales. And in fact, it's kind of crazy, but just a C major scale for a while, and really look at, you know, exactly how I'm doing this. And this primarily had to do with in my case, thumb position and upper positions. And this is, of a very personal nature, but I think, on the other hand, it doesn't hurt to sort of hear about it, because I think certainly throughout my career, I mean, I've made shifts in my playing many, many times over the course of the years. In some cases, it was because I really felt limited by the technique, that I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do, and I needed to expand it. In some cases, that was more specific, like targeted. There would be certain elements that just in the playing that I felt like that I wanted to develop more, and so I would do those. And often I would do this kind of work in May, because that was sort of the orchestra break time, and so I would kind of explore things during that time, and see what would just things that were on my mind during the course of the season that I felt like I could do better, that I needed to improve. So I kind of focused specifically on those things during May, and then I sort of have to kind of pull it together, get up and running, and then go back to the summer season. In this case, I had months before my first performances were going to be happening, so I had a lot of time. And one thing that I had noticed is that I sort of developed a little bit of arthritis in my in this finger, and so I used to sort of bend that finger when I would go play up in thumb position, and it just doesn't bend the way it used to. So it kind of was changing the way my hand worked. And I was adjusting to that kind of when I was performing, just as needed. I would just sort of, work around it and just kind of keep doing what I was doing. But I decided to sort of rebuild my thumb position to sort of see if there was another way to do it that where this was less of an issue, and that meant not bending that knuckle as much. In other words, when I say bend it, it's like kind of like flattening it like this, but instead doing this more, right? And so that just took a lot of time and a lot of exploration, and I had to sort of try putting my fingertip in different places, and I also was wanting it to, trying to get it to sound as best as I could get it to sound. So, kind of changing working with the vibrato and finding which place on the fingertip that it kind of would be most effective, as well as then how to move from that to the other fingers. And so I've literally was totally doing different hand positions for several weeks at a time and seeing what happened, seeing how they went and if they would work or not, and so at one point I was kind of playing on this side of the finger and I was doing everything like that. And I, was trying to adjust to it like that. And ultimately that just didn't quite, something just didn't feel quite right about that. And then, I was trying to play more on the center of it, but then that didn't feel quite right. I ended up kind of playing more on this side of the finger, on that part more, kind of this kind of angle. And then on this finger also kind of, so I could just shifted it quite, in other words, if you see it, I can show you. It's sort of like, I used to do more this kind of thing. And now I don't know if you can see that, but if you can see now. So now it's more, I changed it to this kind of position, as opposed to this position. I used to do that. And so I have this kind of angle. Now I'm doing this. And so far that is, it took me though quite a while to sort of finally come to that. So there was a lot of trial and error involved to get to that point where, I was sure that made the most sense for me, and normally I wouldn't have time to do that like that. It would be like I'd be able to play with it a little bit and then kind of adjust it somehow and in when it was time to play something. But this was like I could really deconstruct it and attempt different positions, and that's what I ended up coming up with. So that's what I mean when I say very in detail. Anyway, so let's see. Personally, I really enjoy tuning to a tuning device, sounding the bass note. What are your thoughts on this? Okay, so this is like a drone. I used to do that. I actually don't like drones. I kind of feel like you need to hear the pitch that you're playing and not in relation to anything else. Just so let's say this is an interesting point. When I'm talking about really knowing what the pitch is, it's sort of like a kind of memorization. So it's being able to remember it by itself, it like as a distinct sound or frequency, and not in relation to something else. And then, so when we actually play in different situations, we can't, we do have to move it. But if we're very clear where it is, then we can hear what the difference is between that and something else better. I think that's the idea I'm getting at. And the drone, I think, kind of skews that a little bit, and you're not focusing on the pitch as much itself that you're playing. So that's kind of why I kind of moved away from that. How do you go? Okay, how do you go about vibrating over the harmonics? Vibrating over the harmonics. And then, so, okay, here's the question I'll say. How do you go about vibrating over the harmonics? I find that with thumb position A on A string, etc., my cello doesn't want to vibrate. Well, I don't know. I mean, I have to see your cello, I think, to really understand if that. But I don't know. I mean, it should. I mean, okay. So what basically helps vibrato work, let's maybe approach it this way, is how well you're contacting the fingerboard. The more kind of contact you have, and the deeper that contact is, usually the more sensitive the string is to the movement. And then when you move, you want to make sure you hold the contact on the fingertip as you're vibrating, so that it doesn't, vary in intensity, the actual pressure, it needs to be consistent. And that way, it should, pretty much any note will resonate and vibrate if you have good contact, with the fingerboard. If you're trying to vibrate a harmonic, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's what you mean. Maybe, but I think I answered it. It's just if I'm assuming that if you're not playing the harmonic, but you're playing A, and it's where the harmonic is, and for some reason it feels like it doesn't, ring or vibrate when you move your finger, just make sure you're getting a good contact there. And it could be that your arm position is not kind of giving you enough leverage there to be able to get that to happen. If you're extended or something, so that could have something to do with it. So you might try moving your arm a little bit to kind of make it stronger, kind of arm weight into it. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Okay. A long time ago, 1983, we played together in National Training Orchestra, then Colorado Philharmonic. That's actually a National Repertory Orchestra now, is what it's called. Can you talk about the role this experience had in your further orchestral career? How can young people get this kind of experience now? Another curious question I have is about which cello you play on now, and of course, the story of the Strat. Okay, so I'm not really comfortable talking about instruments on here, but I can talk about certainly about how do young people get that experience now. Like, this person is referring to what is now called the National Repertory Orchestra and used to be called the Colorado Philharmonic. I did a summer there as principal in 1983. And I think, playing principal there gave me a lot of good experience for them, when I did become a principal in an orchestra, because, there, a lot of it is just, getting used to being in that position, and playing the solos and taking care of the bowings and making sure that, and being with the conductor and trying to keep things together and all of those things, certainly, and also it was, 7 weeks of that, or 8 weeks maybe, and lots of concerts, lots of repertoire. So it was, really getting the feel for what it's like to do that. And, so that I think that it's very simply, just actually doing it in that kind of environment was very helpful in that sense, and because it helped me to sort of to have the confidence to feel like I could do that, there were a lot of solo things in the solo kind of work that you have to do as a principal. There was a fair amount of that summer, and just experiencing that gave me I think a lot of confidence to feel like if I were in that position, I had some idea of how to do it, just by having done it there. that orchestra still exists. So, you know, it's still, I would imagine, very good experience for young people if you know, to audition for that and do that. And I think there are even a lot of other ones too that I'm sure programs like that. But that is a really good one. It's the National Repertoire Orchestra. It is now in Breckenridge, Colorado. It used to be in Evergreen, Colorado. And it's still there. And I think a really great program for you know, playing the repertoire, having the experience of very much like what a professional orchestra is like. So I think it was great. Okay. Okay. What aspects do you consider important or correct to play the beginning of Haydn C major concerto? There are many proposals online, but I would like to know your opinion. Okay. Well, correct? I don't know. I'm a little confused by the question, I guess. Yeah, there are a lot of different things that you could be referring to, like tempo, style, you know, personal taste. I mean, there's so many things that you know. Okay, so I think I can approach it in this particular, maybe this way. Everyone has things that they think are important in interpreting repertoire, and in particular, you know, repertoire from earlier periods, Baroque, classical, etc. And, you know, I think in the case of Haydn C major, let's say, you know, I'm not necessarily very experienced in Baroque cello playing, but I've heard it a fair amount, and I've been exposed to it a lot, so I'm familiar with it. So I'm aware of that, but a modern cello is very different from a Baroque cello. So the things that one would do on a Baroque cello, to do something similar to that on a modern cello, you actually might do it slightly different technically. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is just that for some people, perhaps the historical aspect of it is not a priority, you know. And do I think it should be? I think it's good to know about, you know, the historical aspect of it. That said, if you were to hear multiple people play Haydn C major concerto on a period cello, it would be very different from one person to the next. And, you know, to think that everybody would have done it the same way back then doesn't make any sense either. You know, there were people had different tastes and different styles and different approaches back then too, you know. But I think understanding the music from that period in the genre, in terms of interpretation, like how to interpret it from a historical standpoint is generally makes sense because it was designed as a piece of music with that in mind, at the time. And so the approach to phrasing, generally speaking, in that period is connected very much to the meter and the meter of the piece as well as the rhythm. So there are strong beats and weak beats, generally speaking. Now, that doesn't mean that that's strict and that it's always like that, but often you can see that the way it's written, it kind of, there's a tendency to follow that model. So, you'll notice that the things that the composer wants to emphasize, he'll put on the downbeat, okay? And things that he wants to be more kind of ancillary to that, he would put on weaker beats. So now that said, not all the first beats are equally strong. They vary. So it sort of follows a certain hierarchy as you move through a phrase, that the strong beats are gonna kind of have an outline to themselves, and that everything else kind of then follows. It kind of is sort of scaled around that. So just as an example, understanding that gives you a good kind of vantage point to sort of interpret it and perform it. And then how you choose to implement that can vary a lot, but at least you're understanding how the music was originally designed and conceived, based on how things were done at that time in terms of performance practice. So I think to listen to specific people playing pieces of music, a lot of times students will ask me like, well, what recording should I listen to? It's just something about that just kind of really just didn't make sense to me. And I ultimately ended up saying, finally now, it's like, don't listen to any recordings of it. Listen to other music by the composer. Get to know the composer. If you don't know their other works, immerse yourself in a variety of different repertoire that from that composer, both in periods as well as for instance, with Haydn, the oratorios, or the piano trios, or a piano sonata, or anything, symphonies, quartets. Listening to this and then kind of getting into the sort of the tonality and the concept of sound that the composer has starts to give you a clearer sense of how to really interpret something, I think. And it instead of reinterpreting another person's interpretation of an exact piece. So I would suggest kind of moving away from listening to the recordings of the Haydn Symphony Orchestra, but do listen to Haydn. And then also just to be aware of this, just as one example, this idea of how the music is designed, in terms of, at that time, the phrasing was sort of influenced a lot by the meter. So that's just an example of something that could be informative in terms of an interpretation. And then you can interpret it yourself, kind of understand with an understanding of what it is that you're playing, and you know, then it's an original version. Let's see. Okay. Well, okay, so it says, what do you think makes a great cello teacher versus a good cello teacher? Oh dear, I don't know. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, certainly experience, you know, the more experience someone has, oftentimes, you know, there's, I think there's no kind of getting around that, you know. But I think also it can be done so many different ways, you know. I mean, there's so many different things that can make a difference for a teacher. And then it also depends on who's the student is, you know. I mean, and some teachers sort of work very well with certain students, not as well with other students. So, I mean, you know, it kind of, you know, it's a complex thing, and I think there's not a simple answer to that. I think it's but I do think that experience can make a difference. Let's say it doesn't necessarily make a difference, but it can, you know, because the more that you've addressed certain issues and the more different people you've worked with, the more range you have of experience to draw on to help the next person, you know. Let's see. How has your perspective as a musician and artist changed throughout your career? I haven't thought about it. How has it changed? So I have to think back and think what was my perspective when I was young. Well, if I do that, boy, that's I haven't thought about it. How is it different now? Well, I think I could say that I mean, I've made changes in my life, in my career over time, specifically to continue to be able to develop and grow and learn. So, you know, earlier I was talking about, you know, playing in the Hartford Symphony and then in the Philadelphia Orchestra and in LA, and now teaching at Indiana University. And I think making those changes, I made those changes. I should say this. I made those changes because I felt like at a certain point, I had sort of gotten accustomed to a certain situation, and that I kind of felt that in order to kind of continue to develop artistically, I needed to shift into something different. And I think the last change that I made was coming to Indiana University and focusing on teaching, and then also performing not orchestral repertoire, but only chamber music and solo repertoire. And the reason I felt like doing that was in part because I've worked with conductors for a long time and I have learned a lot from that. But I did feel that at a certain point I wanted to, I knew what I wanted to do as a musician and how I wanted to kind of grow and develop. And I felt like I needed to be able to explore that exclusively. And that is why I chose to leave the orchestra. And that also I felt like I'd like to be able to sort of be helpful to young musicians as well, and make as much use of what I had learned to help young people as they develop. And I think in that sense, my perspective certainly has changed, in doing that. And it's because I made that change that there was the biggest shift. I think the effect that it's had has sort of deepened things in my awareness as a musician and as a person and all of those things. And it's a joyful experience to be, to participate with people as they're developing and learning and being there with them as they do it. Very inspiring and I think it's it has kind of deepened my commitment to being a musician and understanding the value of it more through this change, this most recent change that I made. Let's see. Okay, so I that's the end of the questions. So I'm asked if I have any closing remarks. I think I don't have anything specific as a closing remark, but it's been very interesting for me to answer these questions. To kind of have to think about these things. Some things I haven't thought about really very much, and so I appreciate that. I found them kind of interesting and for me to think about, and I appreciate that. I'm really happy to have been able to participate today, and answer these questions. So thank you, and I think that's all for today. Okay, great to hear from all of you, and good luck with your playing and your practicing and enjoying being a musician and a cellist.